classes, but Robert Grafstein is the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Georgia. He also was the Associate Dean and Interim Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. He received his BA from the University of Pennsylvania and his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. Specializing in economy, he is the author of 2 books, co-editor of 1, the author of numerous articles in leading political science journals. And I'm going to go ahead and remind everybody, please try to stay muted during the presentation. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our course on Marxism. I'm really pleased to see the turnout this afternoon. When I proposed this course, I don't know, it was 5 months ago, yeah. I wasn't sure what the enrollment would look like, particularly since the interest in Marxism over the years has varied a lot. And I decided to take the chance and offer the course because even though the interest varies a lot, I don't think it's random. When the economy's in trouble, when people are worried about it, or when big economic changes are underway, interest in Marxism tends to increase. And when the economy is humming along and everybody's financially comfortable, interest in Marxism fades. And my feeling is that since the financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2008, there has been an underlying anxiety about the economy, concerns about whether capitalism is working as well as it should, and to some extent, the rising concern about climate change has fed into all that. So I figured that this would be an opportune time to offer this course. You know, what's bad for the economy is good for Marxism. It's what the principles. So what we're going to do then is look at Marxism, because Marxism was in fact a response to a major, monumental economic change and associated stresses, social and economic, that started in the mid-1700s in England and then ultimately transformed the entire world. And that economic change was basically driven in 2 respects by 2 forces. One was the Industrial Revolution, an extraordinary increase in economic productivity brought on by introduction of major new technological innovations like the steam engine, things like that. And the second factor to this economic change, behind this economic change, was the development of capitalism. This industrial revolution occurred within the framework of capitalism. And by that, I mean an economic system where markets organize virtually all of economic life. Now, capitalism didn't introduce markets, but for the first time ever in history, people didn't basically produce to satisfy their needs, you know, grow crops, milk cows, that kind of thing, but they produced for the market, and their own individual needs were now almost irrelevant. So it's, in current days, it would be maybe a little ironic, but by no means weird if I told you that there was somebody who's deaf who was working in a factory assembling headphones. The fact that this person has no use for this product is irrelevant. It's a job, right? And they're producing for the market, they're not producing for themselves. And that's characteristic of capitalism. And needless to say, a number of important thinkers, most notably, we're going to think about Marx, wanted to understand this new economic form of economic organization, understand what made it tick, how it was organized, what the rules of the game were, what the laws of motion for it, so to speak, were. And in Marx's case, though, it wasn't as a disinterested observer. He believed that capitalism was fundamentally unjust, and he wanted to understand capitalism to help make it disappear as quickly as possible. Right. So that was what the understanding would be based on. He thought, unlike a number of his contemporaries, he thought that capitalism was a historical phenomenon, and like the feudalism it replaced, it too would have come, but it too will go sometime. And when it goes, it will transition into socialism. So Marx wanted to hasten that transition. So basically, that's what we're going to be covering in this course: Marx's theory, Marxist economics, and particularly about capitalism. And we're going to be looking at the revolutionary politics that are associated with Marxism. Now, having said that, Marxists believe that capitalism is a historical phenomenon, not an eternal one. I don't want to in any way suggest that Marxism itself is a historical phenomenon and alone, and that's what I think some people believe. No doubt it has had enormous historical impact. You know, the Russian Communist Revolution in Russia, communist-inspired in 1917, a communist revolution in China, 1949, inspired by Marxism, and political movements to this day around the world. But I want to start by just maybe a motivational exercise to suggest to you that Marxism today is still relevant, still very controversial. And so the course is a contemporary course and not just one about the history of political economic thought. So let me, the inevitable sharing of the screen. Okay, so let me find the share. Oh, the share. Nope. Share screen. Okay. And here we go. Share. And okay. So tell me if that's working. Everybody see that? Okay. Temporary examples of Marxism's influence and controversial status. First example is from a glossary distributed by the Columbia University School of Social Work to its first-year students. The program is a graduate program, but the glossary is designed to help their students understand the terms that will come up in their classes and in their readings. And so here's the entry from that glossary for capitalism. Wait a second. This is not. There we go. A system. I gotta move this thing. I can't read it myself. A system of economic oppression based on class, private property, competition, and individual profit. Now, we haven't discussed really anything about the substance of capitalism, but I don't think it'll come as a shock to you to hear that this definition definitely reflects Marxism and its conception of capitalism. And, you know, by the way, this is not the definition that would be used in Department of Economics at UGA. Okay, this is a distinctly Marxist take on capitalism. And if you look at the cross-reference here, carceral system, carceral referring to prisons and, you know, incarceration. If we look at that entry, we see carceral system coined in 1998 by Angela Davis. She may be familiar to some of you. She's a very prominent far-left academic, and also until 1991. 1991 was a member of the Communist Party of the United States. She left in 1991, the year that the Soviet Union fell apart. So presumably she has some knowledge about carceral states. Anyway, Angela Davis, I think, and the carceral state reference here shows Marxist connections directly. This is a tweet by the incoming newly elected president of the American Library Association. I just cannot believe that a Marxist lesbian who believes that collective power is possible to build and can be wielded for a better world is the president-elect of ALA. Needless to say, this triggered a certain backlash, predictable backlash. She eventually had to withdraw the tweet, to delete it. But here's from excerpt from an article in the AJC, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, earlier this year. Nearly 24 Georgia state senators, including several high-ranking members, have signed onto legislation that seeks to ban government funding for libraries affiliated with the American Library Association, which they claim is influenced by Marxist ideology. And by the way, Georgia is by no means alone in states that have had this kind of reaction. At a less august level of discussion, this is a quote from the Reimagining American Economy project run by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a very reputable body. Kentucky participant said it's all about greed and profit. This is from an article late last year in the New York Times. For years, many doctors believed they stood largely outside the traditional management labor hierarchy. I realized at the end of the day that all of us are workers, no matter how elite we're perceived to be, said Dr. Aliyah Sharif. You can be a physician or a factory worker, and you're treated exactly the same way by these large corporations. So the recognition that even the medical profession was being absorbed into the economy to serve basically as working stiffs was foreshadowed 175 years ago in the Communist Manifesto, co-authored by Karl Marx and his longtime collaborator, friend, and benefactor, Friedrich Engels. In the manifesto was written in 1848. The bourgeoisie, that's the capitalist class, and we'll be talking a fair amount about them. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into paid wage laborers, and that's the feeling that Aliyah Sharif was getting. The next is a quote from a speech given by President Milei of Argentina at the World Economic Forum or at Davos, Switzerland, held earlier this year. The World Economic Forum, Davos, you may be familiar with it. It's an annual meeting of the big economic muckety-mucks of the world. And so here's his statement before this organization. Neo-Marxists have managed to co-opt the common sense of the Western world by appropriating the media, culture, universities, and also international organizations. Again, Milei testifying to the influence of Marxism today, making my point. Last year, a book published by Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont. This was one of the chapter titles, Capitalism is the Problem. And the book title itself makes the same point. And then finally, a quote by one of the another political figure, whose name may be familiar to you. We're now in a Marxism state of mind, a communism state of mind. We're a nation in decline. Donald J. Trump last March. So this is the preliminary motivation to get you all excited about studying this thing, Marxism. And that's what we're gonna do. But before I do that, I just want to contradict extent my the introduction I was given, the preliminary remarks that were offered to you. I do welcome any comments and questions you might have along the way. I mean, sometimes it's just old hat and just beyond the interest by the time people raise questions at the end. So if questions and comments occur to you in the middle of this throughout the course, I really strongly encourage you to participate immediately. I don't look at these comments and questions as interruptions. I look at them as part of the course. So I hope you do participate. Okay, so let's talk about Marxism. All right, and the first thing is that when Marx wanted to undertake the study of capitalism, he didn't start from scratch. He very consciously was heavily influenced by a number of his intellectual predecessors, other political economists, any number of them. But I'm going to just highlight two of the most important, I think, in his intellectual journey. The first is Adam Smith. Wrong Adam Smith. That's the last time I buy slides off of eBay. No, I mean this Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. This amazingly seminal work that Adam Smith published in 1776, which is an important year for other reasons. And Marx's other major intellectual predecessor was another member of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Ricardo, is on the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which was published in 1817. And that is some of the intellectual genealogy of this guy, okay? Just to give you a little biographical context here, Marx was born a year after Ricardo's Principles book was published. In other words, Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany. Technically, he was born in the Kingdom of Prussia. Until his early to mid-20s, his writing was mostly philosophical and heavily influenced by German philosophy. But in the late 1840s, he began to work in a very systematic, detailed, and penetrating way on economics, economic history, to try to develop a theory of capitalism. And that culminated in his magnum opus, Das Kapital, which was the first volume of which was published in 1867. Volume 2 was published in 1885, 2 years after Marx died. Marx actually was buried in London in, trying to think of, losing the name, the cemetery, Highgate Cemetery. Highgate is a part of London. I once visited a friend who happened to live there in the Highgate area, 2 blocks from Marx's grave. And it's now a area of high-end restaurants and trendy bars. Marx would be spinning in his grave. But this was his masterwork. The third volume was published in, just to round that out, was published in 1894. And this economic analysis that culminated in Das Kapital is what we'll be first thinking about. And Marx, as I said, stood on the shoulders of some really giant thinkers, and I'll start framing the question of how we understand capitalism as they framed it, because that's what the framework Marx accepted. And as Smith and Ricardo tried to understand capitalism, they said, well, obviously we have to understand markets. And if you understand markets, you have to understand exchanges, market exchanges. And the question that just leaps out to you, if you're going to understand market exchanges, is what determines the rate at which things exchange? In other words, I'll take a couple of primitive examples because that's in the spirit of what Smith and Ricardo wrote about in their first examples of economic exchange, because after all, they're writing in the late 1700s, early 1800s. But let's imagine that we're exchanging wooden tables and venison, okay? And so they're going to exchange, and the question is, what rate? How many tables to how many pounds of venison? You know, what's that exchange rate going to be? And this is a really hard question to answer. When you think about it, it's really hard because venison and tables just don't seem to have anything in common. I mean, aside from the fact that deer and tables have legs, I mean, they don't have anything in common. So the question is, what's the underlying metric? What is the common denominator that allows us to compare tables and venison so we can say that's worth, let's say, I'm pulling numbers out of the air here. 1 table is worth 10 pounds of venison. Why not 8 pounds of venison? Why not 13 pounds of venison? Why, for that matter, isn't it 3 tables to 1 pound of venison? So this is the challenge of explaining market exchanges, because it seems like we're just comparing apples and oranges here, and there's no fundamental way to determine what is worth how much of something else. So the answer that Smith developed and Ricardo elaborated to a great extent after him, it's called the labor theory of value, and it goes something like this. Here's the underlying metric, the underlying common standard. The exchange value of a commodity is based on the amount of labor it takes to bring that commodity to the market. So let's take the venison example. Somebody's got to fabricate a rifle. People have to acquire the ability to use that rifle. Then they have to become good hunters. They've got to track down a deer. After killing the deer, they got to dress it. And then they got to transport it to the market. And similarly with the table, you got to create the tools. Somebody's got to master the use of the tools. Then you got to find an appropriate tree. You got to take down the tree. You got to bring it to the mill. You got to take the lumber and assemble a table. And then you got to transport the table to the market. So each of those commodities embodies a certain amount of labor. And so the labor theory of value thesis is they will exchange in such a form that there's an equal amount of labor embodied in each of the objects being exchanged. So if it, say, hypothetically, it takes 10 hours to build and bring to market a table, and 1 hour that is necessary to bring a pound of venison to the market, then table will exchange for 10 pounds of venison, which will equalize the amount of labor involved in both cases. If, for example, I mean, if that weren't true, suppose, for example, it took 13 hours to bring 10 pounds of venison to the marketplace, then people wouldn't bother going after the deer and bringing them to exchange the venison to exchange for the table. They would just directly build the tables and save themselves per table 3 hours of work, right? Or similarly, if it took 14 hours to build a table, they wouldn't bother to build a table and exchange it for 10 pounds of venison. They'd immediately go get the deer themselves and save themselves 4 hours of work. The only relationship, the only exchange relationship that makes sense of that exchange, people's willingness again and again on an ongoing basis to exchange, would be, you know, the 10 to 1 ratio, 10 pounds of venison to 1 table. So that's in its core, the labor theory of value that Smith and Ricardo developed. And Marx fully embraced the labor theory of value, never left it. But in accepting or embracing the labor theory of value, he also inherited a whole bunch of questions and problems that the labor theory of value faces. And we can't possibly go over all these challenges, questions, objections to the labor theory of value that you could raise, but we're going to focus on a few key ones that prove to be central in development of Marxist economics and in the controversies over Marxist economics. Okay, so the first one. So we just indicated that the amount of labor it takes to bring something into market, that's the measure, that's our unit of measure, so to speak, of the exchange value of something. Well, you know, smarty pants, if labor is the measure of what the exchange value is of everything, then what's the measurement of labor itself? You know, well, how do you measure the exchange value of labor when labor is the measurement you're using? Well, Smith and Ricardo actually had an answer to this question. But before I address it, I just want to pause and highlight something that's extremely important for Marxist thought. Capitalism, I said, has markets in virtually everything. You know, markets in corn, markets in soybeans, markets in bonds, markets in stocks, markets in furniture, and so on. Okay, and market in labor. We're all familiar with that. But to Marx, the existence of a labor market is really what distinguished capitalism most of all. was key to understanding capitalism. Because as Marx argued, in pre-capitalist societies, people had their own means of production. People milked their cows, harvested their crops, wove cloth, and all the rest. Under capitalism, for the first time, workers were separated from the means of production. The typical way of surviving was not producing with your own stuff, but you had to go to the labor market to find a job from somebody who owned those means of production that would allow you to work productively, produce something of value, and get paid for it. This was a novel situation. And as we're going to see, it's the key to understanding why, in Marx's view, capitalism is deeply unjust. It's the key to understanding the sort of laws of motion, as I put it, of how capitalism develops, prospers, and then collapses. So the existence of a labor market is just not, oh yes, and there's also labor, that's another market. This is really important. So to answer the question, what is the exchange value of labor, if labor is the metric here? The answer, said the labor theory of value people, was that labor workers don't appear in the labor market spontaneously out of thin air. It takes a lot of labor to get them in position to be a worker fit for service. When a child is born, a woman goes into labor, you have to house that kid, you got to clothe that kid, you got to feed that kid, you got to train that kid before you have a human being who's marketable, who's capable of earning a wage. That's a lot of labor, and it's that labor, says the labor theory of value, that determines the value of labor. Just consistently with tables and with venison and all the rest, it's the amount of labor embodied in a worker who shows up in the labor market that determines the exchange value of that labor. Now let's move to the other end of the process, the final products that are bought and sold in the marketplace. What determines the exchange value of those final products according to the labor theory of value? Well, it's really the same story. A lot of labor is embodied in those final products. There's the laborer's work. We just talked about getting that labor to the workplace, okay? And then machinery. Well, machinery had to be produced with labor. So Marx was fond of saying that workers are living labor and machinery is dead labor. It reflects a lot of labor beforehand that created that machinery. Raw materials, coal. Coal has to be found, it's got to be extracted, it's got to be refined, and then it's got to be transported to the to the market. That's labor. And the factory itself has to be built. That's labor. So if we want to find out the value of the final products, all we have to do is decompose it into all the types and forms of labor and amounts of labor that went into getting that final product to the marketplace. We've already talked about the workers, and then there's the labor embodied in the machinery that helps build the product, the raw materials that went into the product, the factory in which the product is created, and then there's, of course, the transportation, all that labor. You sum all that up, and you get in one bundle, the exchange value of the final product, according to the labor theory of value. There's, however, just one problem, and it's a really tough one. So let's imagine we have some final product, and we say that's the sum of all the labor that went into producing that product and bringing it to the marketplace, and so on. Okay, added up, we got the sum of all the labor, and we got the exchange value. But the capitalist who's doing this is not doing it for charity. We know the capitalist is doing it for a profit. And when you think about what profit is, I mean, it's profit that drives the capitalist system. So we better understand this. If we want to understand profit, we have to say, okay, when the capitalist sells that product, there's got to be something left after the capitalist pays off the workers, pays for the machinery, pays for the raw materials, and pays for the factory. We just said the final product is the sum of the labor built into all that, but there's got to be something left over beyond called profit. Otherwise, there'd be nothing in it for the capitalist. So the question is where does this profit come from? According to the labor theory of value, we know it's an amount over and above the total sum of labor embodied in that final product, but that just states what the problem is. Where does it come from? Well, this question eventually led Adam Smith to abandon the labor theory of value. He just couldn't make it work. David Ricardo definitely did not abandon the labor theory of value and worked assiduously at trying to develop it. But in the end, he had to concede that he never fully could explain the labor theory of value, the profit in terms of the labor theory of value. It's mysterious. And Marx, on his part, had a solution, offered a solution. And let me preface this, laying out the solution by saying that Marx had great respect for many of his intellectual forebears. You can just say he had great respect. I'm just going to tell you that, let me just hold up if you can see this. I know I'm a minor thing now in the screen, but you can see these 3 volumes, let's see, 3 volumes. This is Theories of Surplus Value. Marx wrote these in 1862 and 1863, never published in his lifetime, but they were meant to be the 4th volume of Capital. And those 3 volumes are detailed, systematic analyses and criticisms of other political economists. Now, actions speak louder than words. That's respect. I mean, it's not just, oh, I really respect these guys. I mean, this labor of his showed how much he deeply respected these people, and he particularly respected David Ricardo. Not only because Ricardo is just a brilliant thinker, but because, unlike Marx, Ricardo was a supporter of capitalism. He was very much in favor of free trade, particularly campaigning against the tariffs and other restrictions on agricultural imports that England imposed at the time, basically to drive up food prices and help landowners. And Ricardo vigorously campaigned against that and advocated for free trade. In fact, his work in that area is still the foundation for the modern economics of international trade. His admission after all that, supporting capitalism, that he could not quite explain profits was a very telling admission. And what Marx respected was, in effect, his intellectual honesty, not simply saying, I didn't solve the problem, but realized that from the labor theory of value standpoint, what Ricardo has done, according to Marx, is shown that profit is, in a certain sense, illegitimate. That when you strip out all the labor that actually went into producing the product, that's then and only then is what you get is profit. That profit is not based in any labor. It's just based on the sheer fact of ownership that the capitalist happens to have over that product. It's not due to labor, to an actual contribution to the creation of that product. Now, that doesn't yet explain where it comes from, but what it exposes is a real problem, moral problem or political problem about profits. They have to now be justified as some sense illegitimate. And Marx felt that that was extraordinarily intellectually honest on Ricardo's part. He hadn't solved the problem, but he followed his analysis to its logical conclusion and didn't let his support for capitalism interfere with his reaching troubling and unsettling conclusions about profit. So with that said, nonetheless, Marx thought that Smith and Ricardo, in discussing profit and the labor theory of value behind it, had made what I think, in using modern philosophical terminology, it would say made a category mistake. Namely, Marx argued that Smith and Ricardo treated labor as a commodity when in fact it was an activity. Now that seems like a pretty fine, subtle distinction. So here's what Marx has in mind. It's not an activity. Capitalists don't leave the labor market with a box full of energy or labor activity or something. What they instead do is come away with having bought what Marx calls labor power, which is the potential, not the labor, but the potential of that worker to labor. When that worker shows up on Monday morning, ready to work, that's when that labor power, that potential is released, so to speak, and applied to raw materials and machines and so forth to produce, to add value to what's there. It's potential until it's applied through labor in the actual work setting. I mean, let me try an analogy here, since, as I say, I think this is a subtle distinction between labor and labor power. Let me try an analogy here. And by the way, if this analogy doesn't work, I just ignore it. But imagine you want to buy a car battery, okay, and you go to Advanced Auto Parts, and there's the battery sitting on a shelf. Now, at that moment, that battery is useless. It's just this box, sitting on a shelf doing absolutely nothing. But you're willing to pay for it. Why? Because that battery represents potential, electrical potential. In fact, we have a measure, we can measure that potential, and the unit of measurement, of course, is the volt. Why do you buy? Because when you take that box, that battery with its potential, electrical potential, and you install it in the car, connect it to the car's electrical circuitry, it then gets activated. It now is no longer potential, it does work. It starts the car. It helps run your headlights and all the rest, okay? Now, similarly, in the labor market, the capitalist buys not labor, but labor power, the potential, the ability of that worker to show up on Monday and say, work a 10-hour workday and create new value. That's what the capitalist is buying. And sure enough, when the worker shows up at the factory, they're connected to the factory circuit, work circuit, so to speak, right? And here the unit is not volts, it's labor time, hours or something like that. And once that worker is hooked up to the factory circuit, machinery, other workers, raw materials, boom, that potential starts to get realized and converted into useful products. Now, how does this help resolve our question about profits? So the worker shows up having sold his or her labor power to the capitalist. Monday morning, starts working. And let's say, for the sake of argument, within the first 5 hours of work of a 10-hour workday, the worker produces enough value to offset the cost of the labor power to the capitalist. The 5 hours is, just totally arbitrary. This is determined by economic conditions. You can't theoretically figure out what that number could be. It could be 3 hours, it could be 7 hours of the workday, but we'll just make it 5. And so the first 5 hours, worker produces value, and that covers the capitalist, so to speak, for the outlay for the labor power. But now it's a 10-hour workday. There's 5 hours left. And for the remaining 5 hours, the worker continues to work, producing things of value. But those 5 hours are uncompensated. That value goes entirely to the capitalist. And Marx, therefore, calls it surplus value. Another word for it is profit. Okay? So that's where profit comes from. It comes from uncompensated labor. Labor power is compensated, but the full workday of labor is not. That's where profit comes from. And that's the exploitation taking place in the capitalist system for Marx. This has two significant implications in Marx's thinking. The first is relatively clear. I mean, there's this gaping hole in the labor theory of value. I mean, if you have a labor theory of value of capitalism and you can't explain profit, I mean, you might as well trash the theory. I mean, you know, it's hopeless. Profit being such an essential part of the understanding and workings of capitalism. But as well, profit has a political significance, let me call it, because Marx has now exposed what he thinks it was hidden to Ricardo, it was hidden to Smith, and he thinks it's hidden to most workers, exposed the source of profit as being exploitation. And to put this in the kind of context that Marx had in mind, let's imagine another economic system, slavery. Okay, in the case of slavery, the exploitation in slavery is just painfully obvious. You got workers, I mean slaves, producing stuff, and it's taken from them. I mean, it's just that simple. It's blindingly obvious, right? So exploitation is there. Everybody knows it. The slave owner knows it. The slaves know it. I mean, they don't need anybody coming around with any highfalutin theory to explain to them that they're exploited. So how does this system continue? I mean, there's been slavery through much of human history around the world. You know, it's not like it's a fly-by-night thing that was tried once somewhere. How is this thing sustainable? Well, the simple answer: it's sustained through physical coercion. Duh. You know, it's sustained through the lash. You know, that's how they keep it going. Because it's so obvious, it's physical coercion that needed to keep it going. So let's take a more somewhat difficult or subtle case, feudalism, the system that preceded capitalism, at least in Europe. And here it's a little trickier. The exploitation, says Marx, under feudalism is still obvious. The way that occurs is that the workers, in this case the peasants, owe a certain number of days of work to work on the manor, the land of the Lord, okay? And so those days not spent on the peasant's own farm, it's obvious that the peasant is not being used for the peasant's own good, it's being used for the person above. So the exploitation is obvious. And you could say, well, how is that obvious exploitation sustainable? And, you know, one answer, well, you know, we know with slavery, it was coercion. What about coercion? And without question, for Marx, you know, coercion under feudalism was sort of the fallback option. It was always kind of lurking there as a possibility. And sometimes it was not just lurking, it was used, physical coercion. I mean, throughout much of European history, feudal history, there were slave revolts. I think perhaps the best known were the so-called, not slave revolts, peasant revolts. I think probably the best known in Europe was the feudalism, was the peasant wars in Germany in the early 1500s. Martin Luther famously inveighed mightily against the peasants involved in the peasant wars, and strongly urged the rulers in Germany to kill every last one of them and so forth. So physical coercion was certainly an option, and occasionally they would have to resort to it, but that was not the norm. Peasant revolts were episodic; they weren't a constant fact of life. So the question is, in the lull times, the usual lull times, how was the system sustained? And Marx said physical coercion wasn't really a good option as a long-term constant strategy as it would be under slavery, because of two things. One is, in this case, peasants possessed the means of production. They milked their cows, they harvested their crops, they wove their cloth and so forth. And that would mean that if the people above them wanted to extract this stuff from them via coercion, that was a pretty tough sell, because the peasants had an independent base of operation, so to speak. They weren't dependent on a lord for sustenance, for opportunity to work on land or so. They had their land. And so to extract all their product when they had the product, when they possessed it and the means of production, would take an extraordinary amount of physical force and constant monitoring. And to put it in contemporary political science lingo, the rulers in those days didn't have the state capacity. They just didn't have the means to do that sort of thing. But moreover, the peasantry constituted the overwhelming percentage of the population. I mean, only a tiny sliver of the population weren't peasants. I mean, so much of, history for the longest time focused on the people at the top. And, masterpiece theater kind of stuff focuses on the people at the top. They're fascinating. But they're just, as I say, a minor fraction of the population. Most of them are overwhelmingly peasants. So to keep these people coerced and enslaved, as opposed to in feudalism, would have been very, very, very tough. So the solution found in feudalism was more subtle. On top of this feudal economy grew a superstructure. The economic base grew a superstructure, according to Marxists, a set of institutions, rules, customs, traditions, laws, and religious doctrine that all served to maintain the peace, to keep peasants in their place, to tell them that being somebody who worked for the Lord, the aristocrats, was their role in life, that these people were their natural superiors. Their lot in life was fixed and given. If your father was a blacksmith, your grandfather was a blacksmith, you're going to be a blacksmith. Your role in the world was fixed. And you had to do what tradition, society, norms, and customs demanded, namely, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And religious doctrine, according to Marx, I think maybe the most famous quotation from Marx there is that religion is the opiate of the masses. And sometimes that's misinterpreted as if it's a drug that's administered and people become dependent and addicts or something through religion. That's not what he meant. He meant opiate in the sense of painkiller, that religion helps reconcile people to a harsh, terrible, brutal, poverty-ridden existence, a life that, quote Thomas Hobbes, was nasty, brutish, and short. Quite often, the average life expectancy was 30 years or something, 35 years, something like that. What religion did was say, this is something you should accept. This is something that you should understand. This is something that you should be able to live with, because your reward is coming in an afterlife. Don't expect it now, expect it later. Don't complain about that, expect it coming as later in the afterlife. And so religion is the opiate in the sense of it helps people get through the day, so to speak, and tells them that it's the right, proper, God-given place that they have in the world. So for Marx, unveiling the secret behind profit under capitalism was a major political step, because profits, the source of profits, was basically hidden. There was no obvious coercion, exploitation taking place under capitalism. You showed up in the labor market. Nobody could compel you. It's not slavery. Nobody could compel you to work. You accepted a job because you chose it. person who hired you took you on because that person chose it. It's as Marx said, it's an Eden of freedom and rights, the labor market and under capitalism. And if you take kind of the pure sense of capitalism Marx is thinking about, and you ask one of the characters in this drama, say a worker, and go up to that worker and say, is this unfair? Is this unjust? The worker will say, no, to be honest, of course, I'd like a higher wage, but, I wasn't, this guy didn't make me work for him. I, agreed to the job, to work at this job. I'm getting paid the going wage. I haven't been cheated, robbed. They're honoring their commitments. They're paying me exactly what they told me they'd pay me. No, it's I don't see the injustice in it. And similar with the capitalist, are you cheating the workers? Absolutely not. I'm paying them what I agreed to pay them. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're paying the labor, the value, the price for the labor power. And so Marx didn't adopt what is often common among critics of capitalism, the sort of scandal version of profit. It's not because capitalists are these rapacious monsters, cheating their poor workers and so forth. Honest days work for an honest day's pay. It's just that simple. And everybody sort of sees that way. And Marx's job is to lift the veil over that and show that hidden in there is that exploitation that is not so apparent. And if workers can be educated by a workers' movement, the Socialist Party, and so forth, to appreciate the structural exploitation that's taking place, then they'd be more open to saying, not how do I reconcile myself to the system, but how do I take it apart and start over again, okay? I want to drive home this point because it's really, I think, important. This is Marx's, from the preface to the English edition of Capital. And my standpoint, from which the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. And he was talking about capitalists in that particular setting. Capitalists don't get profits because they're mean, because they're cheaters, because they have no heart, because they're, Scrooges. This is the Charles Dickens theory of capitalism. They get profits simply because it's built into, hardwired in the system. And if they weren't making profits, somebody else would be able to deploy the capital they've invested much better and get profits out of it and have a business that survives. So that is the theory of profit. Okay, so we if you believe Marx, have solved the problem of profit, but we are not done with problems, unfortunately. So I hope you like this little graphic here. Let me see if I can move it up. Let me get back here. Yeah. So wringing the profits out of the poor worker, but that's not the only problem, okay? There's a problem of these exchange values, and I'm going to conclude with this. Exchange values, that is determined by how much labor is built into the products and how much labor, so to speak, is built into the workers themselves, and actual prices you encounter in the actual world. I mean, what some of you may be thinking right now is, well, this is very theoretical and abstract. And I don't see how this has anything to do with the world that I live in. I mean, when I go to buy in the store, and in my example, I set aside money. I mean, it makes things simpler. So normally you pay for something, the seller takes the money and buys something. So we eliminated the middleman, and so we have tables selling not for money, but selling directly for something else, venison. But even so, there's nobody who hires people who says how much labor is embodied in the labor power of that person. And nobody who buys products and says, well, let's see, let me do the addition. How much labor is there in the machinery? And so, I mean, you pay prices and they're determined by supply and demand, right? what is the connection with the world that every one of us lives in and these so-called labor values? And that is the problem we're going to be dealing with next time, because it is the fundamental problem. It's not just a problem of having how to sell the labor theory value, since it seems to be unconnected to the real world. It's a problem because that's very much part of world of economics, prices, supply and demand. And unless the labor theory of value, and Marxism in particular, can link the labor theory of value to prices, show how the labor theory of value can explain prices and make prices comprehensible, that labor theory of value is actually essential to understanding market prices, then it's really got just an academic life ahead of itself, where people study it, but for no apparent reason. So, sort of like studying astrology or something. So this is what we'll be tackling next time. The problem of relating labor values to ordinary prices that we all know and love and see online and so forth. Let me just check. No last minute questions that anybody wants to ask, or?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, good. Now, for everybody, officially, our session, I believe, is basically over. So anybody wants to depart, that's your legal right to do that. But I'm happy to stay on and answer questions and so forth. So yeah, please go ahead.
Well, okay. So sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with the idea of ownership. I mean, who owns the tree, who owned the land,
Right.
deer on, all that. Is there somebody, does Marx or anybody else deal with that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So let me first separate the ownership question into two parts, because sometimes these things are confused. Marx has no interest at all in a certain category of ownership that we're all familiar with. You own a toothbrush, you own a car, you own a house, you own a sweater. That kind of ownership is not, he doesn't care about. It has no implications for capitalism. And if there were a socialist society, presumably people would have toothbrushes, toothpaste, shoes, clothes, cars, and so forth. I mean, some people immediately going to say, well, they'd be too poor, but no. Let's assume they have all that stuff. No, the ownership that animates Marx, that really gets his goat, is ownership, particularly in the means of production. Because this is what gives capitalists that structural advantage, giving them the ability to exploit people. So a worker, yes, the worker is free to work for any capitalist who will hire him. Okay, no capitalist owns all the means of production, not even Elon Musk. But the capitalist class, as a whole, as a class, has a monopoly over the means of production, and it's that monopoly that allows them to extract profit, right? And so for that reason, Marx holds ownership in the means of production to be completely illegitimate. It's historical fact. He does that's a given. But what he hopes is that through a revolution, and we'll be talking about whether that has to be a violent revolution, or whether it can be an electoral revolution. But through a revolution, workers can seize control of the means of production and use that means of production for society's purposes and not for individual purposes of capitalism.
Bob,
Yeah.
This whole capitalist system morphs into modern time to include ideas like profit sharing, like members of workers being on the board. And so we're seeing, if you will, a migration or acquiescence of the owners of capital to these ideas that we need to be more equitable in the sharing of profit. Will we get to talk a little bit about that later on?
Yeah, I suspect so. I hadn't really decided whether that should be it, because it's kind of like, but we should. Capitalist reform, you might call it, as opposed to just throwing out the baby in the bathwater, as some would see it. For this stage of Marx's analysis, let me address the question this way. An objection that's often presented against this Marxist analysis is, in your abstract theory, yeah, capitalists do nothing but own capital, and therefore make a profit. That's it. Okay. But in the real world, and this was particularly true in Marx's time when capitalism was just really getting going, real world flesh and blood capitalists don't simply own capital, they work. I mean, they organize the factory and they market the stuff, and they may actually work on the work floor, on the factory floor, and all that kind of stuff. So this idea that these capitalists are just kind of sitting by the pool, making their profits is just totally unrealistic. And Marx anticipated that. He said, in effect, look, the final value of the product should reflect everything labor-wise that went into it. And if somebody, call that person a capitalist or not, if somebody works on the factory floor, or somebody does marketing, or somebody does transportation, or somebody does supervision of the workforce, whatever that is, if they're adding value to the final value of the product, that has to be compensated. That should be reflected in that price at which the product sells. But the key to a capitalist existing as a capitalist is that when all that money is paid out, when all those payments are made for all the labor contributions of every form, what's ever left goes to the capitalist. In modern econ speak, the capitalist is a residual claimant. The residual is what's left over, the profit, after everything's been paid. And the claimant is the person who is entitled to that. And that's the capitalist. And at the time Marx wrote, those pure capitalists were not as common as they are today. But to get to your example a little bit, in 1932, Adolf Berle, a lawyer, and Gardner Means, an economist, wrote a very influential book about the evolution, emerging natural modern corporation. And one point they made, the central point, was modern corporations reflected the separation of ownership and control. Namely, control of the company, what we might more call management today, or running the company, that's done by paid employees. I mean, they might be really well-paid employees, but they're employees. Think of the C-suite, the CEO, the CFO, and these are paid people, right? And the capitalists, the owners now, say Berle Means, will be increasingly relegated to simple ownership, nominally owning a company, but really not controlling it at all. And these are essentially becoming the shareholders. And I suspect many of you are own stock. And if you're like me, you know next to nothing about the actual operations day to day of the companies that you're investing in. Rather, you collect a stream of dividends, right? And so that is where capitalism is headed and has been heading. But Marx saw that as the essential nature before flesh and blood capitalists reflected this. He saw that as the essential nature of the capitalist relationship. Now, if you modify that to something, tweak it, and say we're going to have profit sharing, we see in various ways workers could exert power to get a share of, or to have capitalists give up some of that profit. I mean, profit sharing in that sense is no different than reducing the workday, or having unemployment insurance, or having a pension program funded by the business, the 401k, or something like that. In other words, there are various ways that if workers can exert sufficient power, leverage, they can force the owners of the company to give up something. And now, as you point out, the ultimate example of that would be, I guess, fully employee-owned companies. I think Costco, for example, is one of those. In which case, in a strange sort of way, the workers collectively are exploiting themselves. And they wear two hats. As workers in that company, they're trying to maximize profit. They're trying to extract as much surplus value from those workers as they possibly can. And then in return, they get profits. They get the dividends from the owning that company. And so they're in an odd psychological position and social economic position, but essentially as owners, they have the same incentives as any capitalist does to maximize profit. And as employees, they are subject to the same exploitation as they were before. Again, does that modify, mute, reduce the enthusiasm for socialism or for revolution? Absolutely. There's no doubt. And we will be talking about that. I mean, for obvious reasons, we haven't seen a socialist revolution in a truly fully capitalist country. I mean, except for very brief periods of time, and Germany had a temporary revolution in 1918, but under very special circumstances. But basically, we don't see that. We don't see in the United States. We don't see in France. We don't see in Germany or any of the Japan, and so on. So yeah, we'd have to explain why the prediction of a socialist revolution has panned out, and why the ones that did pan out, Russia, China, proved very different than maybe the vision that the early socialists and Marxists had. But I think what Marxists say is the central logic of the modern corporation. However, you've kind of trimmed the edges of it and made it less brutal. The central logic is the same, because Costco could only stay in business if it can stay in business against Walmart, which is a family-owned company, stay in business against Walmart, against Target, again, and all the rest, BJ's. And so, it's under the same compulsion, the same constraints to make a buck as any company. Does that help? Yeah.
Bob?
Raven?
Yes. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I enjoyed that thoroughly. My question is that there's an inordinate power balance between the capitalist and the worker, especially one-on-one. And I'm talking from having had a life of being a capitalist. But there's this inordinate balance where the power that the capitalist has is so much more than the decision power that a worker has. Is that something that is addressed?
Something that what?
Is that something that is addressed?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. I mean, to put it in kind of the most direct way possible, to stay alive, the worker needs a job.
Right.
And again, we're talking at this point in a very purified version about a very purified version of capitalism. There's no unemployment insurance. There's no pension programs and a public pension program. We're just talking about brutal capitalism, in its purest form. And workers, you want to eat, get a job, and that is a compulsion that drives workers, and we're going to see very much at the beginning of the next meeting next month. We see very much that very much affects the relationship between workers and owners. Now, in theory, and Marxists have spent a lot of time discussing this, in theory, workers, go on with the Costco example, workers could not have capital. They could have their labor, and they could rent capital. They could take their money and rent capital, and in that sense, run a business without being capitalists, not own capital, but rent capital. For all sorts of reasons, it's extraordinarily difficult thing to pull off. But the modal case is where somebody owns capital, or a group of people own capital, and people are compelled to come to them for a job. And that means that you either accept the going wage or you starve. And that means that workers ultimately are at the mercy of capitalists, except I don't want to turn this, certainly trying to explain Marx's view, don't want to turn this into a personal relationship. The passage I read from Capital, that was volume of the preface of Capital, the capitalists are under the same compulsions, constraints as workers. I mean, they're in a world of competition with capitalists. And in the labor market, workers are in a world, they're not competing with capitalists, they're competing with their fellow workers to get a job and to make a deal with some capitalist. So that in that world of constraint, it's not as though, once again, the capitalists are mean and vicious, but structurally, it's the capitalists who have the means of production, and therefore the workers have to come to them and get that job on pain of starvation for themselves or their families. And so, yeah, that is a economic power relationship, and it's one that exploits workers because it forces them to deliver profit rather than being compensated for all. This country song, I think done by Alabama years ago, Pittsfield, something, hello, Pittsfield, a Pittsburgh steel worker, you work 40 hours for a living, then send the rest down the line or something like that. It's that intuition, kind of, I can't afford the Cadillacs I'm helping produce. I can't afford the things I help produce, and that's the sense, this odd thing, I'm producing things of so much value that I'm not being compensated for.
And this is probably especially true in like small businesses, because the the owner aggregates all the money, the profit, which gives him more decision-making power.
Yeah. One of the things we'll be talking about next time is the first pass at analyzing the system, and before we're basically done, the economic system, is one in where the workers get paid, capital, so to speak, gets paid, machinery has to be paid for, raw materials have to be paid for, factory has to be paid for, and so on. And then there's profit, and the capitalist takes the profit and spends it on consumption stuff, But so that's the capitalist is a decision maker, allocates the capital, allocates the money for the labor and so forth. But in some other way, they have to pay the going rate for labor. They have to pay the going rate for capital. You buy capital, machinery and so forth. There's a market for that. You have to pay whatever the price is. And so what decision-making left is there? Well, what I should consume as a capitalist. But beyond that, and we'll see that's the next step, capitalists can do more than that. They can reinvest. They don't have to simply consume their profits, but they can reinvest their profits. And that is a very strategic decision. How much I reinvest in the company as opposed to simply reproduce the company, so to speak, buy capital for the next year, buy or rehire the workers for the coming year. But more than that, maybe I invest in more capital to ramp up production and become a bigger profit maker, or invest in new technology, which makes us more. That is a major strategic decision that we'll be talking about, because as we're going to see, that ultimately leads, in Marx's view, to a fundamental crisis for capitalism, because what may be a good idea, rational for the individual capitalist to ramp up in the production and invest in new technology and capital may be a really bad result for the capitalist class as a whole. They may be in the process of doing that. They may be in the process of beating each other's brains in. So the capitalists make decision makers, are decision makers. They're certainly much more decision makers than anybody else in the system so far. But I don't want to over stress that, because for Marx, as I indicated in that passage, this isn't a story about capitalists and decision makers and venture capitalists and heroes or villains or anything like that. It's not the drama of journalism accounts of capitalism. These people, they're constrained in their decisions, and if they make the wrong ones, they go under. There is a constrained and as competitive a world and difficult a world to manage as workers are, is they only just get more out of it. That's the difference.
Okay, so
Any last minute questions? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And again, I'll see you next March. What is it, March 18th? Something like that. Anyway, I'll see you on March. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bob.